Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the discussion on negotiating migrant masculinities, jointly organized by Drik Picture Library and Goethe-Institut Bangladesh, as part of our ongoing Take Us for the Fruit of Violence, curated by Vidisha Fadescha. In our panel today, we have amongst us Professor Master Shahid Hussain, Professor of English at Jahangirnagar University, and currently a Fulbright visiting scholar at Indiana University Northwest, filmmaker, artist, critic, and associate professor of visual arts and photography at Columbia University School of the Arts, 𝐍𝐞𝐠𝐵𝐚𝐢𝐚, anthropologist and clinical professor of liberal studies at New York University, Dina Siddiqui, and the Ohio State University, Russell Ahmed. So in our discussion, we want to create conversations based neither in essentialism nor in utter fluidity. And we want to question the existing body of knowledge about masculinities without surrendering to socio-biological determinism. We want to examine the theoretical frameworks developed from thinking through empirical material located in the developed Anglophone nations and understand the composition and configuration of masculinities in Bangladesh. And in regards to that, Bangladeshi people who have migrated to other countries in developed nations and in developing countries all over the world. Without much ado, I would first like to invite Professor Naim to the panel and present his ideas about masculinities. He has been working with his film, which is called The Last Man in Dhaka Central, where he had highlighted the interrelation between doomed masculinity, proletarian unity, and utopian hope. It's about Dutch academic Peter Kusters, and maybe you can make a few references to the idea of masculinity in the 1970s of Bangladesh, and by doing that, we'll have a bit of a history of how masculinities have worked out through the histories of Bangladesh. So over to you, Naim. Are you? Yes, you're on camera, so over to you. All right.
Yes. Thank you, Oliur, for the introduction.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for letting me go first, actually, maybe to set a slightly different direction at the outset, because the panel is called Migrant Masculinities and you refer to mobilities. And when we use the word migration, at least in our Bangladesh context, we're usually thinking of ourselves going abroad, whether temporarily or permanently or somewhere in between, and whatever situations we might encounter in these new places, diasporic condition, and how you navigate some forms of constructions of gender within that. And I quite consciously wanted to talk about my 2015 film, Last Man in Dhaka Central, because the movement there is in the opposite direction. And it's specifically of this Dutch academic, Peter Kusters, who was in some ways unique, but also not unique. He, in some ways, fulfilled the urge to movement that a lot of people thought about. He took it all the way. He was a Marxist and an activist, a believer in left revolution and a communist utopia. And if you follow the logic of that thinking, then the West is exhausted and is not the place where new movements will come. So you must go elsewhere where the spirit of revolution is still alive. In those times, in the 60s and 70s, that was typically somewhere like Algeria or Lebanon, and of course, Palestine in the larger diaspora. And Bangladesh was also one such destination that people either don't know or have chosen to forget. Both India and Bangladesh were places that people thought about as a place where the next left uprising might come. And Peter followed the logic of that thinking all the way to its conclusion. He was in a PhD program at Johns Hopkins in the United States. He dropped out of the program or gradually left the program halfway, never finished, because he thought writing about left politics or transformative politics broadly is false when I can actually be the place where the action is happening. And in his mind, the first stop for that was India. And when he arrived, possibly in Kolkata, he was told you should cross the border because Bangladesh is where all the uprisings are happening. This is around 1973. He ends up living in Bangladesh from 73 to 1975. In all sorts of ways, he starts to think of himself as being from Bangladesh. He learns Bengali quite well, reading and spoken. And perhaps in that moment even forgets that he's actually a white Westerner, a European whose very presence within certain left movements could actually create unwelcome attention onto those movements. When in 1975, as people know, there were 3 military coups in succession. The first one killing Bangabandhu and his family. The second one being the counter uprising, which was 3rd November. And the third uprising was the Sipahi Janata Biplab or Bitroho led by Colonel Taher on 7th November. And when the 7th November uprising eventually also collapsed, among all the people arrested was Peter Custers. He was arrested and accused of being part of the Tahir group. He was in jail for a year. He was obviously tortured and interrogated. And there were attempts made to turn him into a Raj Shakhi against the rest of the arrestees. But the reason my film is also called Last Man in Dhaka Central is because there's a way that he was never going to stay in jail because he was a European in that jail. And so even the Bangladesh government knew that in the end, they would have to release him. And the part maybe that's relevant to this discussion is what happens to him after he is forced to return to the Netherlands, leaving his comrades, who were mostly men in that time, although not all, and actually not ever able to go back. He's actually not able to go back until almost, I think, the late 90s or 2000s when he goes back for the first time. He becomes an exile from the country that he considered his own. And he has to navigate what happened, which is what he does for the rest of his life. He unfortunately passed away about 4 or 5 months after this film was completed. So it's Last Man in that sense as well. With your permission, Oliur, I'd like to share a short clip and then talk about what we are seeing and how it connects to the theme of this panel. It's almost 2/3 of the way through the film. So by now he's already talked about his radicalization going from the Netherlands to Johns Hopkins, at the center of power in some ways. Henry Kissinger taught at Johns Hopkins, and how he becomes radicalized in spite of being in the United States or because of being in the United States, how he's introduced to people like Paulo Freire and others, how he believes in the fact that the revolution will not be here in the West, we have to go somewhere else, and how that leads him to Bangladesh. And this is the part where he talks about actually what happens to him when he goes back to the Netherlands and tries to find a new life for himself in a country from which he has by then in some ways become alienated, where he had expected that he would be living in Bangladesh. So this is the clip where he talks about what's happened to him afterwards. And this is actually one of many Dutch newspaper articles. He became a focus, of course, of intense Dutch human rights campaigning. And this is the headline actually very, in a very low-key way says, Dhaka conflict creates troubles for Peter Custers. And there's definitely an understatement as to what happened to him. Let me know if the sound comes through as well, Oliur.
And by the middle of 1976, it was clear that they were starting preparations for trials. On the one hand, the trial against Colonel Taher, and on the other hand, a trial against the group that I had been the official advisor of, the 𝐍𝐞𝐠𝐴.
De heer Custers heeft in Bangladesh gratie gekregen. Welke rol heeft de Nederlandse regering daarin gespeeld?
We zijn heel vaak met deze zaak bezig geweest. Ik heb zelf 2 maal de ambassadeur van Bangladesh ontvangen. Ik heb ook een beroep gedaan rechtstreeks op de president van Bangladesh. Ik kreeg nu vanmiddag het bericht van mijn collega van Bangladesh dat in antwoord op dit beroep de regering had besloten om Custers uit te wijzen en hem dus te gratiëren voor wat betreft die gevangenisstraf van 14 jaar waartoe hij gisteren was veroordeeld.
Is er politieke pressie uitgeoefend?
Er is tijdens die gesprekken met de ambassadeur van Bangladesh is er heel uitdrukkelijk dringend gevraagd, mijnerzijds, om eindelijk tot uitwijzing te besluiten. Ik heb erop gewezen dat er een goede relatie van samenwerking bestond en dat ik het zou betreuren dat hij op enige wijze in gevaar zou komen.
The feeling of being uprooted from a situation where I had deeply believed in participating in an experiment in social change was totally upsetting. I mean, even now, if I reflect back on that period, it was agonizing for many ways. One, for the fact that my friends were still in jail, and I had to start moving to try to ultimately obtain their release. I had to do that in many different ways, but that was one element that kept definitely burdening my mind seriously. But at the same time, I mean, the degree to which I have tried to integrate into Bangladeshi society, with hindsight, I would say was quite serious. And to reintegrate myself into Dutch society, it was a major challenge. It was really a very, very big challenge. At the same time that the whole possibilities to reflect together with friends about what went wrong, I was also deprived of that. So in a sense, that period after I returned, in a sense, was the most difficult period in life.
How long did that period continue of feeling disconnected? What changed?
Well, after a few years, my work picked up very well. So I had certain creativity to find ways to re-engage myself with progressive causes. And once we have the time to really discuss the cause of my life since the late 70s, there are many reasons to feel certainly to feel happy. But yeah, that first period was very difficult.
Did you find Dutch society to be, I mean, one is of course their understanding of the human rights situation, but did you find Dutch society to be sympathetic to the overall cause of left revolution, to the extent that you told people what you were working on?
The sympathy at that time was overwhelming. And perhaps I didn't feel it as much then as I should have, because of my own mental feeling of uprootedness. Because even my own family members, nobody condemned me. And my family was very diverse. People belonging to all kinds of ideological orientations, with all kinds of professions. But nobody in my own circle of friends or my own ever condemned me for the ideals for which I had gone to Bangladesh and ended up in jail.
So I'll stop there. You're dropped into the middle of the film and then you only get to see 4 minutes, so things won't be clear, but I will say this. If you look at the 2 book covers, which are basically his life's work, these are the ways he recovered himself as an academic and a thinker after being jailed in Bangladesh and after returning to Netherlands, a place he had not thought he would be spending in life. And it's significant that capital accumulation and women's labor in Asian economies, which is the new PhD thesis he does after giving up the previous one at Johns Hopkins, is one of the very early academic books actually to look at the role of the garments industry, labor productivity, and organizing. And the one significant thing I'll just say here, he said this to me in an interview, although not in the film. He said, after I came back, I spent all my time trying to think why the movement didn't work, why we failed so badly. It's not just about the usual stories of betrayal, which is the very typical thing you hear about 7th November, about Tahir's betrayal or Tahir being betrayed, but it's also about tactical errors of who you allied with. And he said to me, we just read Marx and we never read Rosa Luxemburg. So one of his projects after coming back from Bangladesh and throughout the 80s and 90s was to try to recover Rosa Luxemburg and write Marxist histories through her, which is a quite extraordinary act of decentering both the masculine writer Karl Marx and also to center a female theorist who, at least at that time that Peter was working with him, with her work, was not the center of conversation that Rosa Luxemburg is today. This is in the 1980s. And only because he was in Netherlands and not affiliated with a large university, I think that's why his work never came to the forefront. And I see him as someone undoing a certain kind of masculine, success-oriented, goal-oriented project that's also looking for an individual, singular messiah figure who will lead to the promised land. And of course, in Bangladesh, we have a lot of experience of, where the Messiah figure runs aground, certainly within the Bangladeshi left in particular. So there was a process of undoing himself that was still ongoing at the time of his death. I found he was very much questioning the role of the great male figure in left history. And there's a way that he was undoing himself as someone who thought of himself as Bangladeshi or of Bangladesh, and yet was obliged to live for most of the rest of his life in the Netherlands. Yeah, so maybe I'll stop there and say he's an interesting example of both the question of migration and question of masculinity in the opposite direction. And also just to urge that we not think of the category of migration in such absolute terms of where you end up and where you work. And also it's very much tied to questions of productivity. And that was not his quest, because certainly he could have chosen to be happy with just being productive in the Netherlands, but there was a soul search going on for which the movement was very crucial. So back to you, Oliur.
Thank you, Naeem, for that wonderful discussion. I mean, since on that note, I think we can move on to Mashrur Shahid, and also question, and since you have clearly done quite a good of mapping out how masculinities perform in many different settings, and especially the way you have explored that in your film. So over to you, Mashrur Shahid Hussain. Mashrur Shahid Hussain is currently a Fulbright scholar in residence with Purdue University Northwest, Indiana University Northwest, and Ivy Tech Community College, and they're all in Indiana. And we were listening to Naeem just a few moments back, and now it's over to you, Mashrur. And from you, I think since we cannot really think migration as an absolute concept, and as Naeem has clearly pointed out, I also would like to ask you, and that certain formations of masculinities as we think of them now, in terms of Deshi masculinities, and even in our discussion today, migrant masculinities, as we are trying to conceptualize it as well, and point out something, at least trying to do that. So why do you think these conceptualizations could be problematic, or what do you generally think about them? And how do you think notions of patriarchy, heterosexuality, and at the same time capitalist and consumerist economies really shape the cultural construction of men in general, and in regards to that masculinities? Over to you, Mashrur.
Thank you, Oliur Sun. I think I'm audible enough. Okay. You asked about too many issues, and it is difficult, and also it might not be wise to address so many issues in a kind of 15-minute slot, because many things will remain untold, and in these cases, untold things create rather confusions. Okay, but again, I will try to address as many as possible. Hopefully. But of course, as you told that, I'm a Fulbright scholar in residence, and actually I'm a professor at English University. So my stay here is about 8 months, and I'm scheduled to go back. So it is not necessarily based on experience, rather more on theories and observations. So one thing that intrigued me about this panel is the phrase migrant masculinities. Because it mobilizes, it's a common term, but again, it's interesting because it mobilizes both the phenomena involved. Thus, the term migrant masculinities, on the one hand, designates masculinities of migrant people, but it's in plural, it's masculinities. So on the one hand, the plural term dismisses or offsets the fixity of what it means to be masculine. On the other, it upholds the performativity potential of masculinity. That is, it is not solely related to biological males, rather it can be performed by the ones who intend to do so. So that I often use in my class, that is remaking Simone de Beauvoir's famous statement, we may say, one is not born as male, rather becomes one. This leads us to the second connotation of the term migrant masculinities. And if it is adjective, then it becomes masculinity migrates. So in spite of our attempts at grounding masculinity on some fixed prescriptions, masculinity is nowhere the same. So it accommodates apparently conflicting values. So masculinity negotiates between aggression and emotional ineptitude based on what some critics dubbed as an overriding and exclusive emphasis on penetrative sex. On the other hand, it accommodates emotional
and domestic involvement. For example, a father who guides, a husband who provides shelter, a man who loves. So masculinity thus shuffles, changes its role, and updates itself in order to survive and thrive in different situations and different contexts that involve issues of class, ethnicity, race, nationality, age, demography, migration, and whatnot. So there are plural masculinities. Now, the reason that I'm mentioning all these jargons as I intend to, or as I'm asked to talk about or address the term Deshi masculinity. Often it is pronounced as Desi, that is Desi masculinity, with a strong Hindi undertone suggesting South Asian masculinity, more precisely Indian masculinity. The present Americans have increased access to an understanding of Desi masculinity, which is presently informed by the hyper-masculine representation of men, Rajinikanth style, which is chiefly premised upon South Asian films as well as Bollywood films. And these films are presently routinely studied at many American universities. But at the same time, there are remnants of colonial and racial perceptions of South Asian men and masculinities. So it is kind of ambivalent. Now, if we pronounce it kind of Deshi masculinity or masculinities, the focus is shifted to Bangla or maybe Bangladeshi masculinities. The question surely is whether such phrasing is feasible and whether it is useful at all. Surely this 15-minute slot is not enough to address this problematic term. However, acknowledging homogeneity and exclusivity that this term may suggest, the term Deshi masculinity may help us to investigate and navigate three things. First, whether there are some defining features of the perception and performance of masculinity in Bangladesh. Second, how Bangladeshi men, including the migrant ones, view other versions of masculinity, say American masculinity. And third, how non-Bangladeshi men, say the Americans, view Bangladeshi masculinity. So in the next kind of 19 minutes, I would like to explore some ways in which Bangladeshi migrant men in the USA have negotiated masculinities. I'm talking about the USA, though I had understanding of negotiated masculinities of other migrant people, but I'm concentrating on USA because of my present situatedness. But as I mentioned earlier, it is pertinent to mention here that I have been in the USA for 8 months and I'm scheduled to be back to my country at the end of this year. So my understanding relies less on experience and personal experience and more on observation, conversations, and critical literature review. So for today's discussion, let me concentrate on three major factors, three among many, three major factors that inform Deshi masculinities. These are generations, ethnicity, and sexuality. So if I start with generations, it is important when we address negotiating migrant masculinities, it's important that we address the issues of generation and generational gaps, which are crucial. And there are two types of generation we can say. One type is related to spatiality, that is one's orientation to American culture. Thus, there are the first generation migrants, that is people who were raised in Bangladesh and then migrated to the USA. These people tend to bring Bangladeshi cultural practices from homeland to hostland, and they tend to preserve it. Tend to, not always, not everyone. And sometimes they tend to preserve it with aggression. The case is different, however, with the second generation Bangladeshis. That is people who were born and raised in the USA. So they tend to go along with the American culture. And it is questionable whether we should call these second generation people migrants. So if this is a spatial phenomenon, the other phenomenon of generation is temporal. For example, Generation Z, partly because of their exposure to cyberculture, Generation Z is relatively more flexible than the previous generation in negotiating Deshi masculinities and accommodating American or maybe world sensibilities regarding gender and sexuality. So the behaviors at which these gaps are pretty discernible include doing household chores, doing cooking, raising children, driving car, going hiking, going camping, going gym, having a gun, etc. I mean, activities which we often associate with either masculinity or femininity. So if we take one example like household chores and cooking, which are conventionally deemed suitable for women, what we find is that, but I understand through some conversations, what is revealed is that the first generation people, especially the ones who arrived in the 1980s, maybe 1990s, they somehow tend to maintain the existing patriarchal pattern, like women at home and men outdoor. One respondent said that he regretted that he would think this way. Had he come today, he might have responded differently. But this was a common trend with the early first generation migrant Bangladeshis. With new generation, it's slightly different. While most men appear to help women at home, it seems that they do it not because they're convinced, but chiefly because they have to do it. For example, having a helping hand is expensive. Sometimes it's impossible. Now, when men do this, some observe that initially many of these men, migrant men, they take pride in it. They are helping women and they may even brag about it. But gradually this enthusiasm simmers down and they start taking it as a kind of normal practice in the USA. With second generation Bangladeshis, however, it's more liberal. For example, while one respondent's daughter does not cook, other respondent's son likes cooking. So with the second generation Bangladeshis, it's a little different. Another case can be driving, again, which is conventionally deemed a masculine task. So in the with the migrants people, usually men do the driving and women tend not to drive. Even if a wife or a woman knows driving, the usual case is often that when both are available for driving, the men drive. It rarely happens out of compulsion. It appears to be kind of ingrained. However, two other issues complicate these acts of negotiation related to generation gaps. One is demographic scenario. This is a very interesting, very complicated thing. So I'm making complex things simple. So what has happened that regarding demographic scenario, Bangladeshi people who hail from cities appear to be more accommodative than men who came from suburban and rural places. Of course, it is not stereotyping, it's a kind of patterns of behavior that is available. Another is that where the Bangladeshi is in the USA, that is also an important thing. Places in the USA that accommodate many Bangladeshis, and New York and Los Angeles, that even has a neighborhood named Little Bangladesh. These places witness migrant Bangladeshis strongly preserve Bangladeshi or Bangladeshi Muslim cultural praxis. Things can be different in places like Hammond in Indiana, where there are only few Bangladeshis. So here, negotiating masculinity happens more productively. Other issue is educational orientation. If I say it that way, it may sound a little bit classist, that is, educated people are more accommodative than people with less than education. But the distinction, there's a reason why some respondents made this distinction, and it is important. The point that they made is that there are student migrants and there are the non-student migrants. So the student migrants, they have, because they are students, they have access to classes which are multicultural, workshops, they present papers, and they come in contact with many people because they're universities. So they have more spaces to have exposure to different other and American versions of masculinities, which might not be available to non-student migrants. For example, a boy who came to the USA through his uncle, and he's working in his uncle's shop. So apart from meeting some customers, this boy has relatively less access or exposure to other versions of masculinity and performance. So therefore, student migrants have more exposure to, and therefore appear to be more accommodative regarding negotiating masculinity. If this is the generation thing, the second thing that informs Deshi masculinity is ethnicity. By ethnicity, I mean ancestral and cultural traits that a particular group of people share and subscribe. Let me concentrate on or take into account one form of ethnicity only, that is religion. And when we are talking about Bangladeshi migrants, a majority of them are Muslims. So let us concentrate on Islam and being Muslim. So religion somehow conditions everyday and professional practices of many Bangladeshi people, not all, but many. For example, many Muslim migrant men are not comfortable with American masculinity. For example, going beaches shirtless and with little clad female partners. So some even prefer avoiding beaches, and some visit with full pants on, no problem with that. But again, I mean, that is how they negotiate their masculinities or the performance of masculinity. Some men resist adopting American ways of greeting, for example, like shaking women's hands or hugging opposite sex. And they resist, they may even resist their female partners or female family members from practicing American forms of greeting. Regarding gym culture, initially many Bangladeshi men attempt this since gyms are so easily available and accessible and visible. And most of the Americans do this. But gradually, unlike the Middle Eastern migrants, Bangladeshis men visit a gym becomes infrequent. However, they may visit, but they may not want or encourage their female partners to visit gym. And even when a woman visits gym, a Bangladeshi woman, they tend to prefer the slots that Bangladeshi men do not use in gym. There's an interesting observation regarding the performance of masculinity and responses to it. And one is staring at others, particularly staring at women, be it Bangladeshi or American women. And there is a case at a university where the staring leads to a kind of complaint. And when the student is addressed, he said that it's kind of curiosity that he did it. But at the same time, when he was asked not to do this because other women, particularly American women, they are not comfortable with staring, he said that this is the way he does it. It is his cultural traits, and he cannot change it. So he says that he will do it his own way. This you can say a kind of a cultural fundamentalism, maybe a kind of assertion of one's ability or masculinity. But there is another interesting thing, that is one person, when he was asked about it, he said, I'm not sure, maybe shockingly, not my respondent, but a respondent is reporting about a person, a student, that he looks at, particularly stares at Bangladeshi women who appear to be following American culture and not following Bangladeshi, particularly Muslim culture. So it is by staring at them, he wants to make those women feel uncomfortable, to kind of, in his words, to make them aware that they are not doing proper things. And he feels that by staring at them, he will make them aware of that impropriety, and so he stares. So it's a kind of moral policing that person does through staring. Now, sometimes all this leads to, or can lead to, cultural fundamentalism. That is a mindset that considers everything foreign as bad and everything local as good. One of the hangover of improperly digested post-colonialism. So as one first-generation aged respondent said that some parents, some migrant parents, they control and monitor their children to an extreme extent in order to save them from what they consider as non-Bangladeshi and non-Islamic ways of doing. And they even try to indoctrinate their children with stricter religious and other cultural dictates. But the interesting point is these people, particularly the first generation people, many of them are not aware that Bangladesh has changed or gone through changes. Yes, queer marriage is still not a possibility, but living together is. And premarital sex is no longer an unheard phenomenon. So these people, when they're appropriating Bangladeshi masculinity, Bangladeshi sexuality and gender norms, they are not very much aware that Bangladesh also has gone through changes. The last point, which is in short, I will address is sexuality, particularly sexual orientation that informs Deshi masculinity. My conversation somehow make it relatively clear that Bangladeshi migrants are generally uncomfortable if not fully resistant, but uncomfortable with non-heterosexual orientations and performances. They might be okay with American gays and lesbians, but not with family members. And we may have heard of the tragic story of Hasibin Ghulam Rabbi, a 22-year-old Bangladeshi-born guy who killed her parents in 2016. The insider story that I heard is that that guy appeared or came out as gay, but his parents did not accept it. Even they consider it as a kind of illness. They wanted to get him out of it. Even they took him to several physical and mental therapies. Arguably, it is out of this that this boy shot his parents point blank, and it's multiple shots. It is in San Jose, California in 2016. So while the second generation wants to come out, the first generation may find it not syncing with perceived masculinity, perceived gender and sexuality norms. However, the apparently homotolerant scenario provides Bangladeshi gay migrants with courage and confidence. It happens that one respondent said that because he's working on queer Bangladeshi people, that Bangladeshi queer people, that some queer people had a plan to visit or stay in the USA in order to have access this openness, and some people may not be aware of this and later come to know about this when they are here. So gay marriage is still a rarity, yet gay marriage happens, and even Bangladeshi migrant people attend this. What is important is that a migrant person is able to perform his sexuality and gender in his own way. Even when he talks about it, comes out, and even there is homophobic slurs, not only by Bangladeshi people, but other people. One respondent said that he threatened that I will report to Title IX. Now, Title IX is a federal civil rights law in the USA that prohibits any kind of sex-based discrimination in any school or any other educational program, particularly the government-funded one. And so if the complaint is there, there can be legal repercussions. So that somehow gives the person to talk about it. Also, there is a male respondent who is married to a woman, and he told me about his homosexual relation while he was young, and he was in a foreign country. Then he went back to Bangladesh, and now again migrated to USA. So it started with a number of sexual assault, and later now Deshi masculinity, we understand, is a problematic term because of its homogeneity, but it can be deemed a useful term if we want to trace the ways in which migrant Bangladeshi men negotiate perceived and practiced masculinities. That is, when they migrate, do their perceptions and performance of masculinities migrate too. Some are over-enthusiastic either in rejecting, some are over-enthusiastic in accepting. Still, there are cases in which negotiating masculinities lead to a more tolerant, more livable, and more diverse performance of masculinity. So this is my take on, with my limited exposure to the USA migrant experience, about what we call negotiating migrant masculinity. Thank you, Oliur.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that wonderful note. And I'm sure, and on the note that you just have talked about the queer experience and the queer diaspora in the US, on that note, I would like to move to our next panelist, Russell Ahmed, who's currently an assistant professor at the Ohio State University. So we've had conversations like this before with Russell, not in such a platform, but in person. So since Russell has been staying in the US for quite some time now, and his experience of queer diaspora is quite different, and now you're in the academia, and I'm sure there are new perspectives that you have come across now. So from what we've heard from Masroor, and now I would also like to ask you, Russell, how do you think a queer subjectivity really works out in a country like the US? And we know queer diasporic conditions really vary, and how you yourself have experienced or have challenged or maybe come in terms with the ideas of masculinities as you have moved to the US and you were in Bangladesh for quite some time now. Over to you, Russell.
Thank you, Oliur. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm really happy to listen to like all our co-panelists and thinking about like my relationship to all these different categories like masculinity, diaspora, being an immigrant. Now, like I'm labeled as an immigrant in this country where I live in the US. But before I start, I think I don't know why we are having this conversation in English. So we are all, I suppose like this is like mostly broadcasted in Bangladesh. So I will probably code switch a little bit, if that's okay, like between Bangla and English. This two don't go into dark. I really need someone to look at. So Oliur, be my light when I'm having this conversation. And the other thing is like probably Naim by now is like back. The other thing is probably like clearing my positionality a little bit. That I am living in the US. Like I'm a 6 years old migrant now living in the US. But this is not a migration by choice. This is forced migration. So I'm probably gonna speak from an experience of a very small subset of migrants who are being exiled or like forced to leave. And I think that resonates with a lot with, I think a lot of like queer people in Bangladesh, যাদের সাথে আমার conversation হয়, time to time, who are like, oh, বিদেশে যেতে চাই, I want to go abroad. Like, like Bangladesh থাকতে চাই না, because like a lot of time, what I hear from queer community that this is going to solve all the problems, like existing problem of sexuality, acceptance, tolerance, like all of the terms, like some of the terms that we heard from Marshall Shahid, like, homo tolerance. I would probably like to start with, আমাদের a panelটার যে title, like negotiating masculinities, like migrant masculinities, but masculinities as a plural. And I kind of like understand like, where we are coming from, because we have this hegemonic idea of masculinity, the masculinity, like the sort of the heteropatriarchal understanding of like, what it is associated with, like strength, patriarchy, like domination, some form of like, its relationship to power. And we are trying to complicate that, and we're using the like, plural like masculinities, that it could be like, it's not a monolith, like we could be men in so many different ways, or like, also what is our relationship to gender, to understand like this. But I mean, I think like my difficulty here is also, are we suggesting that masculinities, when we are like pluralizing it, like is also some form of behavioral positionality? Are we suggesting that? And like by doing so, I'm just thinking about if this is also bringing us back to some extent, like, the Judith Butlerian like theoretical term, like, gender is a performance and all of that. But a kind of danger যেটা আমার কাছে মনে হয়, like having this like plural form of like, pluralizing masculinity is just thinking যে আমরা যদি একটা watered down version or like a plural version of masculinity, or like what is the watered down version of masculinity maybe in Bangladeshi context. Probably I'm going to bring it back a little bit to Bangladesh, because we kind of borrow this. So this is like most of my experiences coming from like, growing up in Bangladeshi masculinity. I went to residential model, which was like a boys' school. So I was like from a very early age exposed to this like very monolithic understanding like whatever masculinity means. But jokhoni amar mone Bangladesher context we try to pluralize like masculinity, like some of the things like I think Mashrur also like touched upon in America যেগুলো হয় এই diasporate যে cooking, we talk about cooking, যে ছেলেরা কুক করতেছে, ছেলেরা যত্ন নিচ্ছে, ছেলেরা গাছে পানি দিচ্ছে, all this like, like মানে different types of like watered down version of like আমরা men কিভাবে অন্যরকম ভাবে men হতে পারি. I think that is a risky trope, and that could be a neoliberal trope as well, like this like plural version of masculinity, because this is again centering like the heteronormative understanding of masculinity, right? So amar jeta mone hoy, one of my proposition is like, if we really want to like complicate the notion of masculinity, probably we need to think about trans men, right? Like probably we need to think about drag king. Probably we need to think about people jara kina masculinity tai abar reperform korteche, but from a very different gender perspective, right? And this is not my proposition. I think Jack Halberstam talked about it. I think like Judith Butler talked about it a lot. So like our voice barbar center is really important, because even within this conversation of like, masculinity, or aajke amader je conversation ta hocche, who are the panelists, where are we coming from, what's our positionalities, and like our experiences with gender, masculinity, migration, and such, right? So this is like one proposition, like jeta amar mathar moddhe chinta kortesilam je, like plural masculinity bolte amra ashole ki buঝি. The other thing that I think I want to touch upon is আচ্ছা, এইটার সাথে আরেকটা জিনিসও আমি আসলে রেফার করতে চাচ্ছিলাম, এই বাংলাদেশি মডার্ন লাইক কি বলে, এই যে sort of like urban sanitized version of like renegotiation of masculinity which is happening, যে especially in media, যেটা আমি অনেক দেখতে পাই, যেহেতু আমি like like a filmmaker, so I follow like a lot of like social media item, মানে কি বলে যে সমস্ত content surface করে and all of that. Recently I saw this like Nogod, which is like Bikasher moto ekta ora ekta ad banayse, which is Chanchal Chaudhary is selling shari and performing like, in a like like Chanchal Chaudhary is basically an effeminate man trying to sell shari, and I think I know where it's coming from, because there are like a lot of like social media pages nowadays jekhane effeminate men who are like interior designer or fashion designer or like any kind of boutique house chalache, they are effeminate. So like Faruqi, who is really one of this neoliberal feminist trope in Bangladesh, because onek dhoroner content banay jekhane he tries to say je ami pro me too and I'm feminist and all of that, is making an ad like in 2020 jekhane they are like really uncomfortable with effeminate men, যারা কি রাবে ওইটা কোনোভাবে মেনে নিতে পারতেছে না। কিন্তু এই মানে এরাই কিন্তু আবার যখন তাসনুভা আনান বলে একজন বাংলাদেশের ট্রান্সজেন্ডার নিউজ রিডার ছিল, যখন আসছে, দে অল ওয়েলকাম, লাইক ও আমাদের দেশ অনেক আগায় যাচ্ছে, বিকজ উই আর ওয়েলকামিং লাইক ট্রান্স কমিউনিটি মেম্বার্স, উই আর having like like this like moment of like renegotiation with gender, like different forms of gender. But is it different form of gender? Like, are we actually renegotiating with different form of gender in Bangladeshi context? মানে জাস্ট মিডিয়া একটা এক্সাম্পল দিয়ে আমি বলতেছি না, বাট ইন জেনারেল আমাদের যে ধরনের রেফারেন্স আমরা দেখি বাংলাদেশের থেকে, যে ধরনের ম্যাসকুলিনিটি নিয়ে যে ধরনের কনভারসেশন হয়, এই গ্রিকে বলো অথবা পাঠশালাতে বলো, আর অল দিস লাইক লিবারাল স্পেসেস যেগুলোতে মানুষজন আসে এবং উই ডিসকাস অল অফ দ্যাট, আমার এন্ড কুয়ার স্পেসেস বেসিক্যালি, বিকজ কুয়ার স্পেস থেকে আমি এগুলো অনেক শুনি। কুয়ার মানুষজন সারাক্ষণ ও ম্যাসকুলিনিটি ইজ সো টক্সিক, আই ডোন্ট ওয়ান্ট টু বি লাইক ইউ। So I like at that conversation, I feel like it's really like in one way like flattening the possibility of like visibilizing other form of masculinities, other expression of masculinities. So Shegula bodhoy ekta conversation. The other is like really migration and movement, and its relationship with like masculinity, or maybe my relationship with masculinity when I moved. Eitaro ekta neoliberal version আছে। যখন আমি মুভ করছি, my initial like the immediate crisis was the existential crisis that I couldn't cook, right? So I grew up in a culture যেখানে like it was very gendered, like মা রান্না করতেছে and all of that. So I was fed, I was taken care of, and I migrated, and suddenly I lost all of my privilege, and now I had to learn. And that is probably like like Mashurur touched upon it, like a lot of like migrant, like early migrant যারা বিভিন্ন দেশে যারা মাইগ্রেট করে, স্টুডেন্ট হোক বা মানে বিভিন্ন অন্য ক্যাপাসিটিতে, they think that this is a renegotiation with their like gender or like renegotiation with the masculinity, because of Bangladesh তো আমরা কখনো কিচেনে যাই নাই, রান্না করা শিখি নাই। So সেটাও আমার মনে হয় if we really center like masculinity as মানে, or like if we really center the voice of hetero masculine understanding, তখন যেটা হয় we think যে এই thing like like going to kitchen like cook kora and all of that is basically complicating the notion of gender or complicating the notion of like যে ধরনের masculine behavior আছে। But you need to think that a lot of time যদি heterosexual হয়, যে মানুষটা migrate করছে, if that person is heterosexual, this is a temporary phase, right? They are cooking until they get married. So until like a woman is reintroduced to their life, and tarpore they get back to again like their normal cycle of like masculinity. So we need to also think যে এই যে মানে negotiation relationship with gender or কিছু কিছু মানুষজন যারা মানে ফারুকি and all of them যারা কিনা মানে বলে যে না we are like not traditionally like buff masculine like we have মানে কি all the tools যে সমস্ত attributes গুলো আছে masculinity we don't have that and that is the only way of understanding like or like complicating the notion of masculinity is something that I doubt a lot. You know, I feel like that is also performative. You know, say, oh, we are very like we are pro femininity, but at the end of the day, we are not comfortable with like feminine masculine people, or probably like femme people, like femme man. So that's something, and. My personal experience, I think, you know, again, like going to that kitchen, because I come from this community, you know, there is all this conversation, like continuous conversation happening in terms of like our relationship to gender is not just a conversation I started after migrating. It was happening my pre-migration. When I was in Bangladesh, we were already kind of, you know, like with community setups, like organizing conversations around that. And that's why probably like, you know, when I did not go back to kitchen, but when I start like, you know, like developing this relationship with kitchen and cooking and like whatever that means, I think like I sort of like also develop like a pedagogical, like cooking as a pedagogical tool to look at like some of my other attributes of masculinity. So I was just thinking like it wasn't just or maybe, okay, wrong. It's probably wrong. Cooking was not just a tool for me to understand masculinity, but it was a tool to probably more understand my migration, right? So migration এর মধ্যে আমি কি রকমের চেঞ্জের মধ্য দিয়ে যাচ্ছি. So cooking really became like a lens to understand that overall, like, you know, money relationship and the connection with that kind of like shift that happened when I was there. Then I started thinking about like, you know, labor, like what kind of labor experience I have, because a lot of time like we associate migrant laborers with some form of masculinity, like who are able-bodied and who can go and perform some sort of like, you know, working class task. And that's where like I also, I mean, where do I you know, place myself in that ecosystem? Probably, I mean, one way to think about it is that like, because I am like a refugee immigrant in this country, so I went through a phase of like economic crisis and emotional precarity and this kind of like, you know, like loss of friend and family and all of that. I had to, I mean, at some point perform some of the tasks, যেগুলো কিনা কি বলে quote unquote আমরা associate করি like masculine gender performances সাথে, because I did not have any choice. But the moment like I could revert back, the moment I could like, you know, like negotiate that and sort of like climb up the ladder of like this kind of social ladder, like I think I distanced myself from that, because that's not like, you know, who like my body cannot do that, perform that. So a lot of queer people who are like, you know, going through the migration, and queer people who are coming to this country, and queer people who are aspired to leave the country, they may or may not think about those kind of negotiations, because they most of the time আমাদের যে migration is the imagination, like popular image queer community তো আছে, যেটা হচ্ছে কি we are going to go to America and we will participate in Pride rally and we will be liberated, and that's it. And we do not associate this with labor, we do not associate this with economy, we do not associate this with like, you know, our the very like losing the primary caregiver, which is like a lot of time mother, like all of that, like, you know, what it comes with. So yeah, I have like, you know, all these different kinds of questions in my mind and different kinds of like understanding of like how I am constantly negotiating this like quote unquote, like, you know, like what is my like gender, and also like how I associate it with all this like masculine traits. So I think I'm going to stop there. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Russell. And of course, you're not alone. I mean, we've seen this with other forms of migration as well, and we don't really want to restrict migration as a sort of a geographical movement. Although we have in today's panel, the limits of our today's discussion is that we have all our panelists from a particular part of the world, and also we don't want to limit this conversation or the idea of migration to just crossing across borders, because we also have a lot of diaspora that's happening inside the country. You have indigenous people coming into the cities. For example, myself, I come from a very small town, and then my movement from that small town to a city like Dhaka itself has certain notions within itself, and you have thousands of working class men in the Middle East. And just like you said, they also haven't probably cooked in their homes, but they're living in small communities, and now they have to cook for themselves. So we also have that dimension to that conversation as well, and that's our limit for today's conversation, that we are probably not being able to address all of that. Thank you so much, Russell. And with that note, I would like to move on to our next speaker, Dina Siddiqui, who's going to talk about the political economy of migrant masculinities. Over to you, Dina. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to start my timer so that I want to say, actually, this has been such an interesting conversation. Before I start, just to complicate the cooking example and the relationship to the cooking, my father knew how to cook, my mother did not, and my father taught my mother. And it really is, I think that, it's interesting to remember that their masculinities and femininities are so grounded in one's class and other kinds of backgrounds, right? And I certainly did not know did not know how to cook when I arrived in the US at all. I was very unprepared. That aside, thank you so much for putting this together. It's a fairly short notice. It's nice to see so much audience interest. I am really looking forward also to a conversation with the audience. So I want to keep my talking points sort of brief. And I do want to talk about labor and migration. And perhaps I'll make points that are a little bit obvious, but I feel I need to, I'm trained as an anthropologist like Naeem, and we are invested in engaging in maybe deconstructing, unpacking the idea of culture, right? I want to get away from, or at least complicate, ideas of a culture of masculinity, right? Freestanding, just there, waiting to be reformed or waiting to be entered. Masculinity is one part of one's identity, along with race and class and whatever, sexuality. So I think it's a little bit dangerous to think about culture, and I'm not saying people here have been doing it, but we really need to be careful about individualizing. There's a depoliticizing effect that happens when we don't also bring into view the structural aspects of the kinds of discourses of masculinity that are produced, because masculinity is produced through state discourses, through capitalist discourses, through racialized security discourses. All of these come together in the navigation of individuals with their environment. I would like to ground my discussion in political economy, as you say. And there are two things I'd like to stress. I think they've been said, and they're again obvious. One is that masculinities are always relational, and they're co-constitutive. They're in relation to femininities, in relation to class, in relation to where you find yourself. From Agram into Dhaka Shohor into a garment factory, or from, again, perhaps Agram and into a strawberry farm in Greece, okay? So you have to negotiate with various kinds of, that kind of navigation of masculinity, or production of masculinity is co-constitutive with one's, it's relational and it's co-constitutive, meaning that, secondly, masculinities are always contextual. they're shifting according to space and one's particular place in the world. And they're not fixed, as we've been saying. And you said at the beginning, we don't want to think of masculinities as just some postmodern play endlessly, but they're also always, I think, in process. It's important to remember what it is that makes masculinities, that constructs masculinities, okay? And I'm thinking location, I've just been reading in a different context about Hindu masculinities right now in India, for instance. They're very muscular, they're very virulent. Feminist scholars like Tonika Sarkar and Charu Gupta have written about this. It's very different from, so Hindu masculinity in India is very different from the way we would think about Hindu masculinity in Bangladesh, simply because of the context of majority, minority, the politics, the nationalism, right? In the same way, because I think it would be difficult to talk about Muslim masculinity in some, or even Muslim masculinities in some generic sense. I'm going to push those terms aside. I know I was asked to speak a little bit about the religiosity and the secular stuff. I'll try and bring it up in a different way. So I do want to just flag that ideas of masculinity are generated. Somebody, our last speaker brought up this really interesting advertisement. Those are texts, but the state also really produces particular kinds of masculinities and femininities that are important to keep in mind. And one of the things that happens, I think, within Bangladesh, within the development discourse, there has been a very robust production of a valorized, empowered woman, the laboring woman, the microcredit. It's very working class, right? The woman who is going to save the nation. And there's an invisible production, a marginalization of what we might call subaltern masculinities that's there. And that's part of the state and development discourse. I think we have to bring development discourse into the discussion too, state and development discourse. So I'm going to do, in the time I have left to me, I'm going to do kind of the opposite and the more conventional opposite of what Naeem did and talk about migration. I'm taking migration seriously here, migration from Bangladesh to Europe and working class migration. So I'm interested in questions of labor and masculinity. And this is not something, this is not my own work, but for the purposes of this conversation and what we've heard so far, I thought this would add to it. It's something we haven't talked about. One is that transnational migration is something that offers, and I'm not talking about me or you or even going abroad to get a job and a better life, or even, somebody who goes on gets one of these lotteries, becomes a taxi driver and wants a good life. Not quite that. It's at a slightly lower level. Transnational migration, I think, offers those who feel they have no future in Bangladesh, okay, who will have not, because of agrarian crisis, because of dispossession in rural Bangladesh, because of outrageously high levels of employment, particularly male employment, right? Migration, which leads to a real undermining of normative, hegemonic masculine ideas about being the breadwinner or the bhatar, right? So if you have no future, going abroad is the promise of recuperating a certain kind of masculinity. At least that's the promise, right? It's a chance to escape from the prospect of failed masculinities in Bangladesh. Certainly, I think that's how many people have thought of it, especially because masculinities, whether you're looking at garment workers, male garment workers, or those people who work in banks and the large corporations, masculinities have become so much about, this is a real change, I think, about performing through consumerism. right? Consumerist displays of wealth and muscularity, right? That's really what masculinity, you know, it's all very consumer oriented. It's all very market oriented. And there are some people who aspire and are able to get it or get close to it. And there are other people who realize, as there's a term that Arjuna Padrai has, who will stand at the window and the most they can do is lick at the window. They will never be able to see this, right? So for them, going abroad offers an escape. It's an opportunity to remake masculinities that are constantly undermined in the home front, to reinscribe their male, to try and socially reinscribe their male breadwinner status, right? That's what happens. Okay, that's one thing I would say. I want to actually talk about Bangladeshi strawberry pickers, about whom we do hear sometimes in Greece. And some of you may have heard they went on strike a few years ago. They were seen as trouble. Those who went on strike were seen as troublemakers, or as making it hard for the other people who were there to get jobs. Well, it's interesting. What happens when you go there? You know, the promise of escape means you go there and you have to deal, as I said, masculinity is relational and contextual. You have to deal with certain Greek masculinities. And actually, it turns out, because of the history of the Ottoman Empire, there's a real strong, in Golden Dawn, this Greek right-wing party has a very strong Islamophobic trend to it. So you deal with state racism, you deal with Islamophobia, you find yourself othered already. So that's already a form of emasculation that's there. And as Muslim men, primarily Muslim, but also just as brown men, you're constructed, your masculinity is dangerous, is a threat, you're a terrorist, you're criminalized by law. All of that is there, right? So what do you do? Apparently, I just read something last night. Apparently, even sex workers in Greek prefer Greek clients to South Asian clients of whatever it is. So that racism is structural and deep in the psyche, right? So according to research, and again, this is not my research, but I do think this is really important to keep in mind that there's a way in which you compensate. There are compensatory strategies that actually, ironically, fold in very nicely into neoliberal kind of neoliberal strategies of exploitation of labor. So there is, I'm going to turn this off. Pause. There is a what workers do, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, and Indian workers, but particularly Bangladeshi workers, I was just reading about, what they do is they try and show that they are better at this incredibly hard exploitative labor than their Greek counterparts or their Indian counterparts. So they're self-valorizing. They're valorizing their labor and saying they work really harder than other people. And they're trying and build a different kind of masculinity. It's a way to compensate. But what that does is that they highlight their efficiency and they pick on people who sort of, you know, which means that there's a kind of self-exploitation that they go through in order to recuperate their masculinities. And what this does is, of course, those who resist or those who complain about conditions of work are then labeled either lazy, not masculine, or just troublemakers. So this really stops collective action. So masculinity, again, is so tied in with arrangements of power in different kinds of ways and with labor. And I think it's really, really important for us to think about that. I think I have like 5 more minutes. I'm going to stop there with that. I want to say something about the US and class relations, because I you know, my research is on labor and class. And I'm hoping there are people in the audience who will talk more about male garment workers. Again, I think we need to really talk about that when we talk about masculinity and not make this so middle class centric. But there's such a difference in the US between the taxi drivers who come to the US. I live in New York. I see the whole gamut. And those who work at Goldman Sachs, right? And I've taught the children of taxi drivers in at Hunter College and their aspirations. It's very complicated. That's one thing. But also the second thing is we have to be really careful not to valorize US culture. This is not necessarily a progressive space at all. This is a country in which parents by law in some states are going to be criminalized for taking their transgender children to doctors and to therapy. Let us not valorize this country. American masculinities are quite toxic. Women and girls are deeply commodified. And I don't think just being able to show off one's body is a sign of emancipation. Choto kapor, boro kapor, that context, that discussion needs to be put in a larger context, right? We get tied up in this idea of in a secular narrative, secular progress narrative, so that we go from covering to uncovering, right? That we go from a kind of backward masculinities in the US to progressive, in Bangladesh to progressive masculinities in the US. We really need to complicate that kind of binary, okay? And which also means that we need to think, I am very hesitant talking about masculinities and Islam. I just don't think on Bangladesh there has been good enough research, and I certainly haven't done it. But there is clearly people are trying to find meaning. Other people are trying to mobilize Islam and masculinity for sovereignty. There's a lot of stuff happening, and I would be careful. I don't want to talk about that. I do want to say that it would be really, I think there's somebody in the audience, I hope he's still there, Hassan Ashraf, who can talk about male garment workers and their consumer practices. But I've seen, from what I've seen, I've studied primarily female garment workers. There's a way in which their masculinities are undermined because the image of the garment worker is a female image. The empowerment of the nation is through the female labor. And so I imagine that male labor tries to perform a different kind of masculinity to try and compensate for that. But again, I don't know. Anyway, I'll leave my discussion there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dina. Now we can open up the floor for our audience to ask questions. Yes, Maria, you raised your hand, so please, if you'd like to ask a question, do we need to unmute her maybe? Maria, are you there?
I think Maria was.
I think it's Marzana. Is that what it is? Hi, Marzana, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you all hear me? So first of all, thank you everyone for arranging such a wonderful conversation or topic. So I'll just introduce myself a little bit. I am currently in Liverpool Hope University, where I teach sociology. So I just wanted to connect to Professor Dina Siddiqui's point that masculinity could also be state sponsors. And it also needs to be viewed in terms of Muslim masculinity. And I also wanted to mention that I found some similarities with Massachusetts findings as well, that students often have certain group of class or people would have more exposure to different view compared to others. And of course, I agree with Professor Siddiqui's view as well, that we need to question this secular normative form of masculinity and get out of this short clothes versus long clothes kind of parallels arguments. But what I want to say, we also need to understand that in the context of Bangladesh, it's still very heteronormative practice. It's very heteronormative malpractices are popular or promoted. So in that case, we also need to understand that what I'm saying.
I think we hear you and we understand what the point that you're trying to make, and that's the whole point of our conversation anyway. Okay. So thank you, Marzana Kamal, for for your short discussion. I would like to ask Maria Bhuya to ask her question. She was trying to ask a question before. I'm not sure why I couldn't.
I don't think Maria was trying to ask a question. I think she was clapping. She didn't raise her hand.
Oh, right.
She was clapping.
All right, my bad.
Hello, am
Yes.
I audible? Okay, fine. I made a confusion and I couldn't clear it out. Yes, I was clapping, but I just wanted to add comment to the discussion. It was a lovely discussion and I have learned a lot about performing masculinity, and from Professor Mashu Shahid Hussain and Dina M. Siddiqui, and of course Munaim Hussain and Ahmed. So I would like to thank all the four speakers for delivering such lively discussion, and I would like to draw on the discussion of Dina Siddiqui, ma'am. You very pointedly mentioned a point where performing through consumerism, the masculinity which has been performed or which is being performed through consumerism, looking through the window, that point, would you like to reiterate that point? Because I found it very interesting and I found it very relevant to the context from which I am, that is Bangladesh. So, and from, of course, all the other contexts as well. But I would like to hear from you more about this particular point, performing masculinity through consumerism, if that's all right. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Dina, if you'd like to
Should I,
take the question, yeah.
Should we gather or should we just?
Yeah, we can take other questions and then we can leave it to the panel.
Okay,
Yeah.
just very quickly. I mean, I think performing masculinity, I think we've all talked about the ways in which masculinity is enhanced by, say, you know, I was having this conversation with a young nephew of mine who wanted to buy a pickup truck, lives in Canada. And I said, why don't you want to buy a pickup truck? He said, it looks very muscular. He literally said that. This is somebody I love very much, but it was interesting to think about. And I said, but you live in the city. He said, but it's sort of, and he mentioned that my husband had one. So he thought about it. This is consumerism that gives you a sense of being a man, right? And how and then you get cues from your social, from the market, from advertisements, from whatever else, in the same way that performing masculinity is like you get your BMW. I'm using the cars because that's a good, easy example, right? So that's just, consumerism, what you can afford, what restaurants you can go to, Dhaka. Dhaka, you go to a fancy restaurant one night with 4 friends, it's going to be 20,000 takas or whatever, right? It's going to be more than a garment worker's year, right? Income for the whole month with overtime, right? So there is the performing masculinity and there's the class aspect to that. So when I was talking about licking the window, I meant that for some people, the aspiration toward a certain kind of hegemonic masculinity, where you have the right, beautiful wife, it's very gendered. You can't just have a Augustalo wife, right? You have to have a pretty wife with the, hair that's all, done up in the right way, and palo shari and possibly, whatever, hat kata blouse, don't know. But, there's that. But then there are other people in the city, if we're just talking about the city, who will look at these advertisements, right? Who know that no matter how much they aspire, no matter how hard they work, they will never reach that. They will never be even allowed into the place that sells these cars in Gulshan or the restaurants in Gulshan. That's what I mean by licking. They can only look through the window at the other side. They will always be trapped in the other side, but that is a kind of masculinity. That's there. It's a very frustrated masculinity. It's hetero, I'm not saying I'm not valorizing it. I'm just describing it. So that's what I meant.
All right. Thank you, Veena.
Thank you.
I see Hashan Ashraf is trying to say something. Yes, please.
Thank you. Love the discussion. Thank you to all. And also, especially thank you to Dina to talk about the garment workers contexts. So very briefly, what I would like to reflect from what you have said already, that like if we all could recall that what had happened in early 90s, that all of a sudden violence against women like increased in Bangladesh. That was the response to that how microcredit and other women empowerment program focused on women to empower them without taking men into consideration. And then like those microcredit rhymes like Brishti Pore Tip Tip, Isti Dibo Tik Tik, or the question that raised at the village level in many places that NGO Bhai Boro na Shami Boro. So that kind of like development framework with the tropes of women empowerment kind of like antagonized men in a very much heteronormative framework. And that also had a kind of, I mean, not the exact repetition, but there's some similarities when like women empowerment discourses like based on and tied to like women working in the garment factories, they're earning, and then they are like empowered, etc. So there's a long list of like how this is like portraying as something like how to say it, like women empowerment is actually happening, that is portrayed by the brands, that is portrayed by the BGMEA and also the state and political leaders. And so on the shop floor, what happens that it's a crisis of masculinity, that when the same women operator and the women operator gets the same wage or even slightly higher than a male operator, then he feels threatened. So, I mean, there are lots of news about atrocities and violence and assault against women garment factory workers. But what is really not like looked at, that how this relationship between male and female garment workers, and it is just not like wage issue, but when the male garment worker felt threatened, so then the question like comes in the front, that the question of Ashal Purush, like as Dinap also mentioned previously, that the role of Bhatar has shifted a lot. And then as part of my research, I spent inside a garment factory as full-time worker for 6 months. And then there I witnessed that how men become extra violent just because of this felt crisis, like on the shop floor. And then this idea of Ashal Purush is also very much tied with pretty much advertisement-driven like contraception advertisements. For example, the Panther condom, like Ashol Purusher Pochundo, and then he gets a medal every day in the morning, and then he opens his bedroom drawer, so full of medals. So, and then, I mean, there's also a lot of leaflets and then pamphlets are distributed in major bus stands in Dhaka, that if you have any performance anxiety, if you want to have it's all these kind of like, and there's also this phrase called Kolikata Herbal, that if you have this, so it's like very much sexual performance also tied to the understanding of like the masculinity among the male garment workers, like who are approached by these alternative solutions of healers. And then this is like the so-called the dominant notion of being a bhatar is kind of like being questioned by other women, that makes them a bit more, how to say it, violent at times. And then that is also addressed by like organized mobilizations of particular political platforms. For example, Bangladesh Islami Andolan to recruit male garment workers, like they are marginalized in those places, and how to like claim back that place. And then many workers, male workers, they also organize Islamic preaching sessions. So as Dinap also mentioned, that, I mean, this is just not about, I mean, there's a kind of like how the notion of masculinities, the ideas of masculinities, the way they emerged, and kind of like structurally tied to larger processes of how like capital accumulation is done in these garment factories and also beyond the garment factories. So, and then masculinity and consumerism, like for example, like how, for example, the TV advertisements of energy drink and then these particular mobile SIM cards, the way they initially targeted affluent urban youth, that also went beyond the class targeted advertisement. And then like consumption of energy drink used to be very much performing a deviant behavior that used as like accommodating what was lost on the shop floor being a man. So
yeah, I think
so
we need to wrap up anyway. It's been really long. So yeah, I think, and Russell has to leave as well. So Russell, if you have any last words, I don't see any hands raised. So if you just wanna maybe say your last words.
I don't have any last words. Thank you so much for inviting. Thank you. It was lovely being here and listening from him.
Mashaikh Hassan has his hands up.
Mashaikh, please.
Thank you so much. So I actually have 1.5 question, if that makes sense. So my question is to Masroor sir, and at last I'll have to like share kind of a regret note to Tina Siddiqui ma'am. So I'll start with the questions that I have for Masroor sir. So when you were talking about Deshi masculinity and the term masculinity, like after having been trained in anthropological training, I have developed this understanding of nuanced masculinity and what actual conventional masculinity is. So whenever we are trying to be specific with the understanding of masculinity, we use the adjectives like patriarchal masculinity or subcontinental, various other kinds of adjectives to be as specific as possible. So whenever you're talking about masculinity, even the conventional one, we have this very specific image that kind of occurs in our head, and that's very abstract. And when we're talking about the kind of masculinity that was presented by Rajnikant, that is one kind of masculinity. And if we talk about the kind of masculinity that was presented by Amitabh Bachchan, that is also another kind of acceptable masculinity, but both are very different. So within the conventional framework, there are multiple kinds of acceptable masculinities, which can be very much distinguishable from the alternative masculinities. So when you are talking about the homogeneity of your overall idea of the term, Desi masculinity, so what are the essential traits that you think are common among all the types of acceptable Desi masculinities?
All right, thank you, Mashaikh. I think we can also take Naveen's question because we are running a bit late already. So Naveen, if you just ask your question and then we'll leave it to the panelists.
Sorry, I can skip if you want. You know, I don't really have a big question.
It's fine.
I just wanted to, I guess, underscore the question of class, right? And maybe ask or just comment on how it's not just about masculinities or performing masculinity, but also emasculation in the various places where we arrive as immigrants, right? So there is a difference between how Bangladeshi workers, irrespective of class position, are treated in India versus Malaysia versus Europe and in the United States, right? So, for example, maybe everybody knows this, that Bangladeshi migrant workers in Malaysia are sort of seen as Shah Rukh Khan, and so there's this high demand for Bangladeshi men as suitors there, or marriageability market and so on and so forth. Not quite, say, in the United States, right, where there's always this sort of subliminal way in which they can easily be seen as black or brown or terrorist or Muslim or whatever the easy way in which they can be emasculated in, as opposed to women who often find it easier to counter the kind of stereotypes that are imposed on them, right? And I guess, here's just an invitation to speculate, or we could just leave it as a comment. Thank you. Thank you for such a lovely discussion.
Thank you, Naveen. So very quickly, we'll go to Professor Masroor first, and then we'll hear a few words from Naeem, and then we're going to close the discussion for today. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. But as I gave a disclaimer at the very beginning that in 15 minutes slot, it is even unwise to address such issues like masculinity. And when I was asked to talk about it, I said that it's very problematic time and 15 minutes is not good enough. And I knew that confusion will arise. Again, if we make long story short, that if we can define certain features of Deshi masculinity. As I said that when we say Deshi, it has the Bangla undertone, so it refers particularly to Bangladeshi masculinity. When it is Desi masculinity, which is more like Indian masculinity. So therefore, when we talked about the Rajnikant style, this may inform the South Asian masculinity that the Americans may have, but it may have little or nothing to do with Bangladeshi migrants. Again, since we're talking about Deshi masculinity and the risking kind of homogeneity and exclusivity of the term, we may say the kind of performance that we find in Bangladesh, that we may call Deshi masculinity. And the point is that how that Deshi masculinity is negotiated when someone migrates. Now, we may identify, what I identified in my discussion, maybe 3 elements, but I'm not confident about the acceptable and unacceptable or alternative kind of masculinities, because the term acceptable is itself problematic. Again, we understand is that something which is in practice, which is in vogue, and another is which is not in practice, but can be in practice. So the one point is that I mentioned about the doing household chores or cooking, which are usually deemed a women's job. So Deshi masculinity somehow considers it women's job. Again, men can do this, and men who do this are kind of progressive. Second is that's about the sexuality. That is how masculinity informs sexual orientation. For example, gay or transgender, these identities are often associated with femininity, and which is not necessarily so, but again, it is usually associated with. So the perception of sexual orientation, one's perception to sexual orientation informs our perception of masculinity, which tends to be more aggressive with its relation to penetrative sex. The third is how Deshi masculinity is informed by religion. But again, there are several variations, because though it's a majority Muslim, there are majority Muslims there, but there are also other people from other religions, and understandably religions inform a performance of masculinity and condition actually masculinity. So religion matters, but again, one thing is that it is the performance of religious doctrines that somehow help people to avoid, but Siddiqui said that even the toxicity of other versions of masculinity, because masculinity has its own toxicity, and be it Bangladeshi or American or whatever, it's a world masculinity or human masculinity. So at some cases, religious doctrination or indoctrination can even help us overcome some foreign toxicity in the name of masculinity. So yeah, for the time being, I may want to identify these 3 aspects of Deshi masculinity. But again, not that I formed I'm working on this term. It is for today's sake, I address this term. I am very much aware of the problem of such term, but I found it useful if it is properly developed. Maybe someone else may, or Oliur may have done this job if they found it fine.
Thank you so much, Mashroor. Naeem, any last words?
Sure. I wonder if I should say this, but maybe I should. Of course, there's no obligation for any person asking questions to comment on everybody's papers. But I did notice that there were no comments about Peter Custer's, and that may partially be because it was at the beginning of the panel, so naturally, by now an hour in, it's forgotten. But I also wonder, in the spirit of provocation, whether it indicate that we still have an approach to research, academic or otherwise, that we need to see our reflection to be interested in something. Yeah. I've said it in other contexts that we have a tremendous amounts of agita, angst, and expressed discontent with the lack of Bangladeshi, by which we usually mean Bengali and Muslim. We completely invisibilize any indigenous voices and any non-Bengali voices, including Urdu speakers in Bangladesh, for example. And so all our all our angst about what should be represented, what should be talked about, what the world should talk about. Why doesn't the world talk about XYZ? Why aren't we here, there, everywhere? And why every single newspaper article about quote unquote diaspora achievement obsessively, and I think narcissistically talks about how it's the first Bangladeshi origin person to do X, Y, and Z, until eventually we'll of course run out of first things to do, and we'll have to find other things to climb. That whole sort of blind spot of always interested in that which reflects ourselves and our egos might be reflected in the fact that somebody like Peter Custers is just puzzlingly uninteresting to people. It's my least watched film. It's literally shown once in Bangladesh, and not for lack of trying. And when I did it, the first question that I was asked is, why are you making a film about a European man? What about all the other Bangladeshis who were there? So Bangladeshi history also has to be with Bangladeshis in the midst of it. So I'm not saying that Peter Custers needs to be anybody's interest or anything, but I think there is something here about our need to always see ourselves in the mirror, and our interest range is only limited to what we consider us, very problematic as that is. And I just want to say, maybe it's the time to bring it up. Dina Siddiqui, myself, Naveen Murshid, we all signed this letter denouncing LSE for having a conference where there were supposedly in the first panel, no Bangladeshis present, a panel on 1971 history, although we'd struggled to find a Bangladeshi who's written a book on 1971 history in the last 10 years. But the number of signatories on that letter was always something I thought about. There were more than 300 plus signatories collected in a very short amount of time, less than 2-3 days. So there's a way that our desire to center ourselves in everything drives our interest in academic research. And maybe we miss out a lot of things as a result. And I think the whole tendency to have auto-ethnography in every presentation where we're supposed to also speak from our own experience as what position we occupy, whether we know to cook or not. I know these are natural instincts, but I think they also quite limit what sort of discourses we're part of or what sort of discourses we generate. So that's what I'll say.
Thank you. Wonderful. And Dina, maybe we can end this with you. We have about 1 minute, and I really don't want to go.
No, I just want to second what Naeem was saying.
Right.
In fact, I could have asked him a question, but yeah. No, I don't have anything to say. I'll say that we do need to decenter our, we need to have more. I don't know who the we is. I'm going to have to stop saying we, but researchers working on and within Bangladesh really do need to decenter or ask ourselves what we are writing and why, right? Is it just to see ourselves reflected on screen, or is there something more that we want to do, right? So I'll just leave it there, but thank you. That was a really interesting discussion.
And I think it's wonderful not to end that with self-reflexivity. And I'm sure, the idea of self itself plays out in the idea of masculinity itself. And, it's, well, I don't want to be a positivist, but then, how do we question ourselves? So thank you so much for joining. I know everyone's joining from different time zones and you have other appointments to keep. So I would not make this longer and just end this here. And I'm sure these conversations will continue and we'll explore other areas as well, including this one. So thank you so much for joining, and we'll see you soon, hopefully. Thank you so much. And thank you all the participants.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right.